Uh,
Sorry. Oh yeah.
we're he probably doesn't speak the same way, but we're very, very distant cousins, like second or third or fourth
Right.
cousin. So
Ah,
yeah, Derby,
that's where you get the
Newcastle.
football skills from, mate.
I'm not sure about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, he would have been playing when Derby were at the baseball ground, I think, before they went to Pride Park. Yeah. Uh,
Did he
Gabbiadini
play
era,
up?
surely.
yes,
Oh, did
that's
he? Was he
it.
play
Yeah,
then? He wasn't like
yeah.
Paolo One Chop as well, was he? The back end of then, or has
No,
he gone to?
no, that'd been before. I
Yeah.
think I
Just
might be
before.
wrong, but I think he would have been a little bit before that. Yeah, yeah. So,
Oh, it's a good team.
oh, it under Jim, what was his
Smith.
surname? Jim
Oh
Smith.
yeah, that
Yeah, they
was
had a right
Jim
team.
Smith. It
Derby
was.
did.
They did.
Yeah,
It
they
was the
did.
Oxford manager.
I
Yeah.
can't. I might have it wrong. I can't remember that well, but it was either at home or away to Man United. I remember beating Man United. One chop scored a couple. Yeah, like
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
unthinkable nowadays. Yeah,
Yeah, they had a
and
couple of other
yeah,
foreign players, I remember, yeah. Back of
yeah. Ranio, Stimac.
Iranio, that's
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
it was
yeah.
Some
Stefan
right players.
Aranio.
Yeah,
Mm.
Stefano Iranio. Baiano.
He was.
Oh, there we go.
He was Milan, wasn't he? Aranio.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he had some right players. Yeah.
Good.
Anyway,
Yeah.
that's yes, that's Sean Kitson, and welcome to Sean. We'll let Sean introduce himself in a second. We went off on a bit of a tangent there about football and whatnot, which is very, very closely related to today's theme. But we're joined by Will. Will, we haven't seen you for a while. Are you okay?
Oh,
I
I'm
know you've
okay,
been
mate. Yeah,
busy.
been
Promotion at
busy.
work.
Yeah, recently been trying to develop the School of Sport and Human Movement at the University of Waikato. So we're going great guns, mate, and it's good fun. But I've been absent from this for a little bit, so great to be back.
Yeah, cool. Good to see you back. So Sean, could you give us a bit of an introduction? Like what you do, some of the things you've got going on. We've had a chat before we started recording, so loads of stuff to talk about. But yeah, over to you, Sean, if you will.
Yeah, morning Martin, morning Will. So yeah, my name's Sion Kitson, bar the dodgy spelling. I work for England Futsal in terms of trying to develop and grow the sport of futsal within England. And I'm sure we'll come on and talk a little bit more about the context and history around that a little bit. And I've been involved in futsal for about 20 years, player, coach primarily, and now on the development side of it. But similar length of time in sport from a sort of talent, coach development, broader sports development, and worked at a few different governing bodies of sport over the years. So recently at England Hockey and previous to that at Sport England. And it's always been around kind of, yeah, the coaching space, the talent space, athlete development, that kind of thing, which is what I love. And yeah, look forward to sort of chatting a bit around that from a futsal perspective as well. So thank you for having us.
No, it's great. So closely related to, I'll say soccer because we do have North American listeners and Southern Hemisphere listeners. Soccer slash football. Could you just give us a bit of a description of what futsal is like, just for people that might not know what that is?
Yeah, I mean, there's a great hashtag flying around, best sport on earth. So I'll start there using that. Yeah, futsal. So it's five versus five on a hard surface court, primarily indoors, played to lines. It's 40 meters by 20 meters. So to help the listeners, same size as a handball court. And it's also got the same size goals. So it's an invasion game, going from one end to the other. Very fast game. Ball is played back in with kick-ins instead of throw-ins. But in terms of the rest of the kind of laws of the game, similar to football in terms of corners, free kicks. There's an additional element of a foul count. So similar to basketball, each team gets 5 team fouls per half. And if you go beyond that in a half, it keeps going back to our 10-meter line, which would be like the free throw line in basketball. So it's a high octane, high speed, the physical demands, the technical demands of playing in very small spaces under a lot of time constraints. I suppose makes it a really exciting game for well all of us. Doesn't matter what age you are, but obviously particularly young players getting into a sport like futsal.
And correct me if I'm wrong, is the ball different, Sean?
Correct. So it's from an adult perspective, it's a size 4 and it's 30% reduced bounce, and ultimately that means it spends more time on the surface, and it also then becomes, I suppose, an interesting opportunity, if you like, in terms of ball manipulation. How do we look at things like deception, disguise? It adds another variance to what you can achieve as a player.
Yeah. I know one of our colleagues, Ben Strafford, he's written about futsal as a donor sport for football or soccer, where essentially what the argumentation is that, playing other sports, it's good for more general motor skills, general skill development. Yeah, and this idea of playing futsal or football to go the opposite way, yeah, it would be a donor sport, so you can generate a more diverse range of motor skills, and then specify in the target sport. Yeah, so I could see how that would be quite valuable for maybe young or even players performance type footballers to really benefit from a different skill set, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of, I remember doing some research. This was on slightly older players, under 19s, under 21s, and seniors. But the number of times you accelerate and decelerate and change direction in comparison to, say, a football game, because of the nature of being on a 40 by 20 and a reduced space, and because the speed of the game was far increased. So like that ability to change direction, well, that's pretty fundamental in most sports, or certainly invasion games. So yeah, there's definitely an element of that, and I think it's just also the nature of those, what we call those key constraints, kind of the surface, the ball being two of them, actually enable opportunities for probably development over a period of time. And because of the 5v5 nature, increased acceleration of learning because of that kind of opportunity that it presents itself. So yeah, I mean, my son's has been around for, sorry, probably 10 years of that 20-year journey of futsal. And yeah, he's not a big football sort of guy, but really enjoys his futsal. And actually, those hits are really intense, but really exciting. And he's never really played a football game, but his development has been crazy. That's goalkeeping, by the way, which again is probably another opportunity where a young player can get a real good fix and a real acceleration of learning from being involved.
Mate, and I know it's a sport in its own right, and I don't want to sort of just set it up as a sort of small-sided version of soccer, but given certainly in the UK, where you sort of see less play now with young people, and I know this is some of your work in Sport England, where you've been interested in play and how that might shape young people's development. Like, tell us a bit about how futsal is being used in and around the country to sort of not necessarily replace, but give those opportunities around play and development for younger people.
Well, I think it's an opportunity to reframe what that physical activity experience is, particularly for those that perhaps are not so inclined for a traditional view or a traditional opportunity. If you look back at the roots of where kind of futsal has come from, it's South America, originating originally in Uruguay and Montevideo. This idea of kind of being innovative, a lack of space in tight communities, trying to find ways in which to get the upper hand. I think it's quite exciting. It's quite innovative. It's quite creative. It allows an exploration that perhaps is lost in some environments for youth sport. Certainly, my time, as you mentioned, at Sport England was trying to explore the work of physical activity from the perspective of the young person being central to that, and how do we play their way. And I think futsal, look, whether it's self-directed on a hard surface between mates, or whether there is an aspect of some kind of coaching, irrelevant to that, the nature of the game generally fosters an imagination, an innovation, a creativity, because of the I suppose the space and the time. And I think that just lends itself really well to young players or young children looking to find a sport that's exciting, that they can take ownership for. It's that sense of freedom, that sense of actually probably something I would compare it to it, and I think there's an opportunity in this country is looking at some of the emergence of lifestyle sports like skateboarding and parkour and things like that. And having done a little bit of work in those sports at my time at Sport England, like this idea of peer-to-peer, self-directed learning, this idea of working out and problem solving together. And then if that's facilitated by, say, a coach to support that, then I think that can be done really well. And I think there's opportunities in that space that I'm certainly looking to explore through futsal. What does that kind of, I suppose, if you look at it from a coaching lens, what does that kind of facilitation look like? What are the ingredients that support and help those young people to thrive and get an experience from the game that ultimately they want to get from it?
I think when you was talking, Sean, before about your son and his experience, it just dawned on me like if you're a young kid who's just wants to get involved playing football, why on earth would you play 11-a-side over futsal for the reasons you've just described? And then thinking about the Play Their Way initiative, one thing that always struck me is that who wouldn't disagree? I don't think many people are disagreeing with that for the reasons you spoke about. Thinking about self-determination theory, like more autonomy, more relatedness with the coaches and with your peers, working things out together, which would hopefully lead to more competence. But one thing that's always struck me is that the problem is you can have that philosophy, but if you're not changing the system that you're trying to implement that philosophy in, ultimately you're not going to change anything. And what I mean is, if we use football as an example, you've got a competition every Saturday or Sunday morning, and that, from my observations for rugby as well, drives a lot of the behaviours. So it doesn't become play their way; it becomes play the adults' way because they want to win. They have very different motivations to the kids. So it's always struck me that you maybe got this this philosophy that we're trying to, or this approach we're trying to implement, which is, again, I don't think anyone would disagree with, but we've got this like butting of heads with this system that's just always going to, push that away. This sort of wantingness to win and be the best and compete and all these, which are all good things for young children to experience, but it's experiencing it the way they want to, and not the adult motivations. I think that's the issue. And I'm just wondering, like, is it a better opportunity with futsal because it hasn't got all this history of or we've always have a league, we always do it a club or whatever. I'm just wondering, is that a better opportunity to, because it's so new or newish in the UK anyway? Is there more of an opportunity to maybe adopt some of these ideas that are more child-centered?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe so for a few different reasons. Firstly, as you briefly touched on there, there's not the same social, cultural kind of historical connotations around the sport or the game. Obviously, it's been around a little bit now, so I don't always get asked what is futsal. I get asked, where can we play? How do we access it? Well, it's just kind of the history over the last 20 years, how that question has changed, which is a positive one. But that's probably also grounded in the fact that there isn't that same level of exposure, and therefore whether that's parents, whether that's children, haven't developed a preconceived idea based on, hearing someone else's experience of playing football or rugby or cricket, where obviously there's a much more embedded culture of what that looks like or what people think that's like, even if they have not played the game. So, yeah, I think that's probably a really big opportunity. So, at England futsal, we're on, the first few steps of the ladder, but really wanting to talk about an experience. We want to talk about what does that look like, in terms of the development of young players, particularly if they start to progress within the game. How do we retain that sense of self, that sense of identity, or the autonomy, as you've spoken about, being really connected to each other? And I think that's what the game does. This idea of 5 versus 5, the strength in those relationships become really, really strong. And I think that's really powerful for young people. So I definitely think it's something from a cultural perspective. But then if you bring it back to kind of the coach education and development, I also think we have an opportunity to kind of call out, if that's the right word, or influence positively, the game's too quick. The more you say and the more you do, you might just end up getting in the way. From a pure coaching perspective, you're generally just getting in the way. Like the game's gone. Why are you talking? The game's moved on. Like they're having a great time over there, and you're still worried about something that happened 10 seconds ago, which in futsal is you got to stay in the moment with them. It's about ultimately trying to help young children or young players and older players to manage the changing demands of the game that are happening constantly. So if you're still stuck talking about, I don't know, a decision or something else, you're going to be left behind. So I definitely think on that perspective, I'm really keen to explore how do we get those strong messages of playfulness. How do we get those strong messages around, empowering young players? It's their game to own that creativity, to explore different ways of doing things. Because I think that's ultimately wedded to the game of futsal. Like people, what things, in terms of from I suppose day dot, looking at different ways of playing, exploring different ways to utilize the ball, technical actions, whether that's shooting, whether that's more tactical actions around how do you manipulate space and time. Like that's been a constant, and I think that's something that futsal will hold true to, and I think that's exciting for young players and potentially coaches as well.
Yeah, brilliant. It made me think. Sorry, Will. Just quickly, it made me think about the episode we did with Jamie Hamilton. So he talks about relationalism and he's traced it back, and it has got some roots in South America. So it's maybe a bit of that. You're talking about social cultural,
We
backdrop. Yeah, it could
we
closely
we
related to that.
Yeah, it's something actually. We're doing got a CPD event before one of our England men's home games, and I think I've got a slide on there about one of the coach's responsibilities is to help players to start to see the relational cause between that changing environment and what's happening. So we still talk about systems and positions, but actually it's very much moving away to roles and responsibilities. And can you identify your role within this situation, and how might you interact with your environment as that starts to change around you when your opponent does X or your opponent does Y, your teammate does A or B? And that, I think there is definitely a strong connection to the idea of, I suppose, what relationism and some of the work that's starting to appear in football from that perspective.
Yeah.
On that, Sean, I was going to ask about you talked about the intensity of the game and not getting in the way too much. So what does your coaching craft look like? And I know you've done the 11-a-side work as well. So how does your craft change, and how are you trying to sort of paint pictures for players? Give us a bit of an insight as to what that might look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, like you said, I've obviously coached football when I was a little younger, but primarily been in futsal. And my 20 years of coaching futsal have been alongside, well, playing for 18, 19 of those. I've kind of stopped within the last 18 months. So I've always been figuring it out from my perspective as a player, and ultimately wanting to get better and wanting to develop. And then how does that situate itself in a team context, and how do I support those players around me? Ultimately, what am I trying to achieve? If we take it from kind of a development performance perspective, it's kind of like, can players adapt to their environment? Can I provide them to tools to thrive as it constantly changes? And ultimately, that's under pressure because of we've already documented the lack of time and space and the proximity to the two goals ultimately. Um, Creates a sense of pressure, which I think people actually the players really enjoy, you really like, because it really I suppose everything has a meaning, every inch, every millisecond, and ultimately that's what I'm trying to support players to think through and understand. And it's not for me to give them the answers necessarily, but really work at creating pictures and working with them to support them to, okay, what does the learning offer in this situation? What is the I suppose all the different constraints around you in your environment support you to find solutions to problem solve. That's I suppose in essence what we're going after. But underneath that, they need to sense that. There need to be a real freedom around that and an opportunity that they're expressing themselves, that we're co-creating those opportunities together. So if I'm learning off them, I can start to shape future practices or start to reframe things and think about my language, think about my interactions as well. But we we try and deliver at match intensity. That's really important in terms of the relevance of the game. So high intensity, we might bring the volume down a little bit, and it's ultimately about recreating specific situations within the games. This will be now, I suppose, I'm talking more probably at the higher end of the game. I suppose over probably the last 5, 6, 7 years, being much more specific in certain situations in the game that players experience. And we take that challenge. Let's take that, put a spotlight on that challenge that we've seen that our players will face regularly. And from that challenge, start to build, okay, what does practice look like? How could we start to play around with practice, the design of that practice in order to facilitate opportunities or affordances, if you will, for players to exploit that challenge and start to hone their senses around that challenge, the perception of that challenge, the understanding of that challenge, and ultimately how they go and make decisions and actions. And I think that's enabled us to then state back, okay, what does that require? Talking about the space, the time, the distribution of players, the start points of practice. And then as we get into it, are we weaving in those moments for conversation? Are those conversations in which the players are leading? Is it grouped together? Is there interactions with us? How do we want to interact today? Is it just letting them explore, or are we going to be in there a little bit more supporting and guiding? I think that's then the kind of the relationship building we want. Like I don't, I always say this to players. I don't stand there and say, look, I've got all the answers and this is what you need to do. But I do frame their thinking and learning with some pretty specific questions about how they're seeing this situation. Why is that important? And for us, a big piece is probably the shared affordances. Where are they generally connected when they go back onto court around those solutions and opportunities? Or is player A doing one thing and player B is doing a completely different thing? And therefore you never get that coordination. And again, in a sport like futsal, that could be quite costly because of again the space and time available to you. Hopefully that gives a bit of a flavour of what we try and get up to.
Just a teeny weeny bit. What struck me, Sean, just listening to you for the past 20 minutes, whatever, is you've got quite a sophisticated view of coaching. I think so. The way you think about it, the way you actually deliver it. So, how on earth have you got to that position as a coach? Like, what's your journey
Well,
been like? Why are you thinking this way?
wow. First of all, I do listen to yourselves, and I've been doing that for a number of years. Coaching, I think I was a coach before I was a player. That even as a 5, 6 year old, right? That's how I saw the game. I remember having a. This will take you back as we were talking about the Derby team of the mid 90s. I remember watching Gazzetta Italia football early
Yeah.
90s.
Channel
Oh my
4.
Channel
word.
4,
Channel four.
James Richardson. But the hour before that, or the hour after it, there was a community village session. Grew up in a village, and I remember this chap, Tony Varney, was the coach. And do you know what? He was probably the coach closest to that perspective of play their way. Facilitated, didn't get heavily involved. And now looking back at it, he was really good with constraints, the parameters he set around the session, the spaces that we used, the way scoring systems. I can think about the scoring systems back then, emphasis on development through rewards, risk and rewards, and things like that. And then you'd come home, and obviously back then Italian football was absolutely at its pomp, and start to watch some of the players. Like, I remember like Boban at AC Milan, for example, or
Oh,
players like George Weah, and dribbling through 10 players to score a goal. And there was definitely some connection between that being my Saturday morning for probably 4 or 5 years. And then as I played, football, always felt it was about understanding the game. I wasn't the fastest, not the strongest. So like, how do you survive? Well, up here, using your intelligence, using your, I suppose, awareness of space, game understanding. And I think then probably spent a number of years in football where found that always a challenge, because not every coach, but a majority of the coaches were, well, this is how you play the game. This is what I need you to do. Why? Like, maybe let's have a look at the why question. Why do we have to do it that way? And then in finding futsal, and I did both for maybe a year or two, and playing a half decent level of football. But no, futsal just offered something from a coaching and playing perspective that just hit the mark. The challenges around, well, how do we overcome these problems? How do we work together as players to do that? And I think that probably comes back to the point around the social cultural sort of positioning of where futsal is. No one came with any ego or baggage around that. We came with a genuine perspective of, well, how do we overcome our opponent? How do we move? How do we coordinate ourselves individually and collective to exploit our opponent and whatever they're doing? That probably is the basis. And then, okay, fast forward, 10, 15 years, coaching is really important to me. Well, I probably need to underpin my own coaching philosophy here. What are the frameworks that determine how I act as a coach? Hence, starting to read literature, research, and I suppose being in the beauty, being connected with people like Will and other sort of academics and coaching practitioners out there, is starting to bring that back into my environment. And actually, that's the thing, you've got to put this into practice. So work around, how does questioning and answering look like between players and coach? How does discussion, like spending probably a good 2 or 3 years exploring what those interactions look like? How do we tee up? How do we, like, if we talk about sort of like our outcomes or intentions of sessions, how do we actually work out what are the ways in which we tee up this information, and then review and consolidate that information at the end? These are all examples of kind of me going, that's really important. Who's going to do something about it? Well, me. I need, if I believe in that, I think that has an impact, I need to do something about that. And ultimately, connecting with good coaches and good people around us, particularly within the futsal international environment, which, yeah, let's go on that journey. Like, we're doing a lot at the moment around the interactions with players. How do we tee them up? How do we set those up? Where do we want to leave them when we come back out? How far do we take it? So that we get it wrong, by the way, as well. We get a lot wrong, but that's, I don't know. I think that's probably just who I am and how I see the world. And I think coaching's ultimately very powerful to do that.
Yeah. Well, the getting it wrong bit, I think that's just, I always like to talk about fail-safe experiments. Really, coaching is a series of fail-safe experiments, even in a performance context where you might be refining and you're going into a competition. But yeah, I think that's really impressive. I've got to say, this idea of taking something and trying giving it, understand it in the context that you're trying to operate in, and dwelling in that space and seeing how things work, tweaking, and that is really for me coaching and coach development. Yeah, not sat in a
sure,
classroom staring at a bloody PowerPoint, even though there might be an
sure.
element of that. Yeah, brilliant. Go
Martin,
on,
a
Will.
question to you, mate, maybe, because something that, apart from mentioning Boban, and I was thinking about the midfield that Croatia had when you were I think I saw them at Wembley once. There's one of them, Boban. Who was the other?
Is that
Robert
a band?
Prozinecki.
Is it a
Prozinecki.
band, Boban?
Robert Prozinecki and Davor Šuker. Great
Oh,
side.
I mean, yeah,
One
Prozinecki,
of the things I
there's a
was going to
player.
ask, well, mate, great team. I was going to ask you actually, Martin, and then circle back to Sean. You said something in there, Sean, that really struck me. And the question is to Martin because of rugby, I guess, and rugby league. You were almost arguing, I think, that futsal doesn't have all the answers, maybe. So it's giving you a chance to be creative with your coaching. But certainly when you all started out, my question is to Martin, given the work you've done, mate, in forms of life and so on, is just I wonder if sports like football and rugby have got so much knowledge out there that it's almost resilient to innovation because we kind of know, oh, look, well, we kind of know how to do this, right? Whether it's formations or principles or that's the way we play or whatever. So, yeah, I wondered if there's something maybe around futsal that's not got that dogged resilience, or a dogma around how we do it, and therefore we can be a bit more creative with the way we go about it.
Well, culture is more infectious than the flu. Apparently, I read it the other day and I thought, do you know what? That's so right. So yeah, I mean, if things are steeped in historical, political, so I'm gonna just warning you, Sean, I'm gonna jump into your chat for in a minute, but historical, political, social, backdrop, it's so influential in how people think, so powerful. So a sport I was involved with really recently, wheelchair rugby league, it's got none of that. It has a little bit. It sort of came from France, southern France, so it's got a little bit of that. But it's easier to try and implement different ways of doing things, challenge thinking, because it's quite young, immature in its way. So yeah, I mean the way Sean's talking, I think if I don't know if you do lead on the coach development element, Sean, but if you're rewriting stuff or writing from scratch a coach development program, and if we could take some of the real good principles that Sean's been talking about, I think potentially that would be easier to implement into futsal because it's not. I know it's not new, but it's not got the historical backdrop of football. Now, potentially, you still might be engaging coaches that have got history of coaching football, rugby, or whatever, who might want to get into futsal because the kids play or whatever. They still might have hang-ups around what coaching is, because if we think about where coaching came from in the UK anyway, it was ex-service people post the Second World War that were going into schools and instructing physical activity, and it sort of emanated from there. I can't remember the chap's name. Somebody Day has written about the history of sport coaching.
Dave Day. Yeah,
David Day. Is it Dave Day? Yeah, really interesting. So you can trace it back where these ideas of what it means to be a coach and to be in front of a group of individuals and actually coach them about a sport. I mean, Sean touched on it a little bit about, this is how you'd go to play the game. These are the skills you need or the techniques you need to master before we can go and play the game. So that is still dominant. I mean, that approach, I know there's papers or research that suggests we're moving away from that, but you go and watch a netball session, you go and watch a rugby session, an athletics, whatever it might be, swimming, anywhere in the country tonight or over the course of a week, you'll see that approach. That's a dominant methodology that informs people how they're going to go about that coaching practice. So, yeah, I don't know. Look, it's not fair of me to talk about futsal and how that might work, especially when Sean's here. But maybe if you haven't got years and years and hundreds of years in some cases of history around that, then it's going to be easier to maybe probe and get people thinking differently about how they're going to engage with this group of individuals and the sport of futsal. Yeah, I think if that I've gone off on one. I'll be really quick, Will. One of our Patreon members, Phil Corson, fascinating guy, is fencing. And he was telling us the other day he's found this coaching manual from the late 1800s, and
Wow.
he's like compared it to the most latest coaching manual, and it's virtually identical in terms of the content. I was like, no, you want it. Well, it's like the recent paper we did. So I went and took a picture of the locations and spaces paper. I took a picture of the gym at Sheffield Hallam, and then
Yeah,
I found I think it was early 1900s, a school in Sheffield, and they're identical, exactly the same lines, the same equipment, and it's like over 100 years apart. It's bonkers.
incredible, mate.
But anyway, so that's and the point about culture's more infectious than the flu. It absolutely is.
Yeah,
It just
yeah,
I'll just jump it in there. I think look, futsal does have a history, not as long as other sports. Depending on where you are in the world, South America,
yeah,
it's been going a lot longer. But in Europe or somewhere like Spain, Portugal, from probably 70s, 80s, and then obviously more recently from a country like England, really the last 20 years. There were pockets of activity before that, but really the last sort of 20 years or so. So it does present opportunities. Clearly like any sport or any invasion game, there are fundamentals, there are principles. But what strikes me from what you were saying there, Martin, was kind of like, well, how do we serve those up? Like how do we present those? And that's the key. We have a choice. We can present them like they've always been presented, and I suppose do we just get the same results as a result of that? Or I suppose the way in which futsal, this comes back why I think there's a real promotion of figuring out who you are as a coach and figuring about who are the people in front of you. And as a result of that, how do you serve that up? And hopefully
yeah,
it's lending itself to coaches thinking differently, breaking down the same problems and challenges ultimately of the game, but then serving that back up in a really exciting and meaningful way for whoever that is,
yeah,
whether that's a 7-year-old, their first experience of the game, or someone who's played 100 times for their country. That's that's the beauty of coaching, where I think futsal has an exciting opportunity to say to we've got a lot of coaches that will span across youth coaches that span across football and futsal. And what I guess I'm hoping that futsal can possibly play a role in shaping and inviting a different set of behaviours that actually has a really positive and rubs off from them from a football perspective. If I know a lot of coaches, and you mentioned this earlier, that they're an individual coach, but they're wrapped around a broader cultural context, like a club, for example, and they feel constrained, like I want to be this, but I'm being told to be that. And I think maybe here's an opportunity to help them try and break and chip away at that.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
Um,
nice.
yeah, I think, well, just on that, the way you were talking about interactions, coaching interactions, Sean, really sophisticated. I know Will and I's, uh, mine and Will's colleague, sorry, get my words out, Danny Newcombe, he's done a great piece of work around this. So that coaching interactions piece, I think, is so important, and you don't learn about it anywhere. There's nowhere you can go and find out about coaching interactions, like the way you engage. I know you might get taught about questioning or feedback and all that type of thing, but it's not really coach interactions. They're just things you might do to try and help somebody. But yeah, the skilled interaction of a coach, and I do think Will's point, that is a craft. That isn't a science. I think that is something you need, like you were describing before. You were taking some things that you wanted to get better at and going and playing with them and trying them out in your environment. And it's you were spending years doing this, and I think that's where you develop craft. Yeah, good.
So important, mate.
Yeah,
We're doing a piece of work in New Zealand, just looking at some of those challenges. There's sort of like some really nice ideas in New Zealand. Balance is better, Sean, which you'll know about. That's very similar to some of the ideas in play their way. But you speak to lots of coaches, and they're sort of saying, "Well, yeah, I know it's a good idea, but how do I do that? When do I
yeah,
go in? When do I coach?" And like those are the interactions that Danny, not just those, but those types of things where you're trying to really spend a lot of time noticing what's going on
yeah.
in the practice, and so that you can interact. I think it's like a real difficult craft actually to get right.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, it's like this stupid comment you always get about constraints. Well, do you know when to and what constraints to manipulate? Like, please, really. Anyway, it's like that. Like, you just can't, because every situation's different.
Yeah.
You, so that's why it is craft. Do you know what I mean? And I think the
Yeah.
more skilled you become as a
Yeah.
coach or doing that, like you said there, well, it's noticing first, isn't it? How good are
Yeah.
we at noticing stuff? Or are we
Yeah.
so too obsessed with following this plan of, oh, we've got to do this, that, and the other? Yeah, so be more receptive to what's going on. I think that's maybe a start point. Yeah, so
Yeah.
um, Sean, developing a performance culture, England futsal under 21s case study. Really curious about that. It's not a test. And also, what's a practice architecture?
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, I was reading your chapter last night, just sort of getting a feel for you and what sort of you're doing. So I know that's a really open question, but if you would you mind going into a bit of that? We'll put a link to
Yeah.
the chapter in the show notes. But yeah, so just the full title is professional knowledge development in performance pathways, a futsal case study through the lens of practice architecture. So quite a bit to unpack there, and it was with the futsal England futsal under 21 team. So yeah, over to you really. If you could just explain about, sounds really interesting. It's got a sociological feel to it throughout, which fascinates me. So yeah, if you could sort of explain a bit about that, would be great.
Yeah, no, I guess it's I suppose steeped in myself and coaching colleague Pete Vallance, who's obviously one of the co-authors of the chapter with Simon Phelan. um, in this idea that probably a lot of our coaching derives from that social, psychological sort of space and corner. And before anyone sort of gets panicky, yes, of course, it's loaded with a huge amount of technical and tactical understanding of the game, but ultimately it was looking at this idea of practice architecture and how do we construct an environment in relation to those practices from the point of kind of three areas really, in its simplest terms. The kind of relations that we have between players, staff and players. Maybe there's a wider support staff. How are those relations supporting that experience of practice? At what point does that motivate, inspire? What opportunities does it afford? If the relations are in a particular state or place, that's going to have a knock-on impact to how someone experiences practice. Also, it speaks to kind of like then the language that's layered between those relations. And I'm really mindful, and I mentioned to you briefly, we've just come back from Moldova with the first ever um, Lionesses England women's futsal team in their World Cup qualifiers, and we did a documentary video. And again, I was just listening to the video, really trying to pick up on my language to the players, but also the language that players adopt over a course of time, and how does that impact when we ultimately perform or practice. And then the last area looks about ultimately our actions. And within whatever that kind of practice space is, what are we affording them? For example, um, or is it all coach led? So from the moment we enter that physical space of the training environment or the performance environment, are all actions led by the coach and followed by our athletes? Do we ensure actually that's flipped at times and responsibility in the actions shift to say the players? Is there a construct of some of those actions between players and coaches? So ultimately, that was what we were trying to, I suppose, explore over the last, well, in that at the point of writing the book, the 3 years previous around what we'd done within the England Futsal Under 21s development squad. And we kind of boiled it down to this idea of practice architecture and the relatings, the language and the actions that we underpin. And how is that, if we're really aware of that, how is that supporting performance? Hopefully that gives a bit of a nutshell.
Yeah, no, no, really, yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. Yeah, really, really interesting. Yeah, Will said similar to the work I've done. Simon was actually an examiner of my thesis. Yeah, and he
Okay.
mentioned this. So yeah. So what was the? I mean, again, really interesting. I suppose alignment between the staff, how the language they're using. Is there a consideration around that in terms of the impact it has on the players, the athletes? Yeah, really interesting point. So I know it's a case study in the sense you're not trying to measure anything, but what was the sort of conclusion, Sean, about that going through that process? What did you find? Is there any sort of findings that we can maybe
Yeah,
share?
if you, it comes back to ultimately I mentioned briefly like the development of an England futsal DNA, and ultimately coaching craft and coaching philosophies that help and support players to thrive. And coming back to this idea that in any given moment under pressure, can a player adapt? Can they exist within their environment and ultimately thrive with it? So from our perspective, it was almost playing back. Well, do we believe in what we're doing in the sense of supporting that ambition? So, do the way in which we develop relationships, the way in which we use language, and the way in which we act, and when I say we, the collective we, staff, players, etc., is that allowing or supporting that ambition to happen? And I think it does to an extent. Ultimately like things like for me, so with language, absolutes. So if you use absolutes, what I mean by never, or you can't, or you must not, or that that wouldn't be cohesive to say the ambitions of trying to create imaginative thinkers, problem solvers, individuals that can express themselves, individuals that can, I suppose, start to take ownership and accountability for their actions. So that's an example. And I think within the book chapter, there's a case study where we're exploring a conversation around, I think it's first line pressure defensively from memory. And again, starting to explore, I suppose, more the use of open questions, the more conversation, probing around particular parts of whatever they're doing, whether it's from a physical angle, from a technical angle, whether that's body shape, positioning, timing, a social angle, the coordination, because it's with two players, the conversation, and trying to ensure that that space is left for them to discover, to learn, to come back to us and say, actually, this is what we've learned and discovered. Are you seeing what we're seeing? So that's one example where I suppose the idea of those three aspects, supporting the broader vision, the broader, I suppose, view of how we see the development of performance.
Sounds like
And
a lot
just
of what you're doing is on purpose, mate. I wondered if you maybe just tell us a little bit about this question. That I don't think you've taken theory and tried to put it into practice, but you've definitely started to over the years I've known you align some theories to your practice and really go after things on purpose, whether that's language or intention or practice design. I just wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about how you're using some of these conceptual ideas to frame a bit of your coaching.
Yeah, I mean, in its simplest form, what do I ultimately like? Just take me personally now. So not I suppose the wider coaching team, but that's crucially important. Like, how do I think I'm going to get the best out of a young person or an athlete? That in its simplest form, and then what? Okay, I think we've spoken about this. What is the context? So the current context of England futsal is very different to what it was 5 years ago when it sat under the FA. Whether that's the social cultural factors around that, whether that's around more of the domestic game and where that's at, and where the players are, and the competition that you're entering into, and what are their needs and wants, and from that ultimately trying to work out how we best support. I think in all of those situations, though, and you could throw in how much contact time do we have, how much resource, how many coaches, etc. But I I believe I'd still stay very close to that idea of trying to develop ownership within players, ensuring that there's a level of their own learning and taking ownership for that, helping them to work through the environment that's in front of them and supporting them with their decision making and building intelligent players. It was interesting. reading some articles because again, trying to how do we weave the physical aspect into this? And we did some work with a group of players a while back where we tried to coordinate or try to measure the straight line speeds and then speeds when they've got like a defender running alongside them and how they get into the space that they want to exploit. And it was interesting, not necessarily the players fastest in a straight line or can accelerate the quickest were most effective at exploiting space when you've got someone running alongside you or you're trying to dribble with a ball. So yeah, in each of those situations, it's trying to help players, whoever they are, build a level of understanding and an awareness and intelligence through the art of, I suppose, this coaching craft. And I'm really mindful as a result of that, like my actions, the language I use, what is the closeness of this kind of relationship that between athlete and coach or athlete and athlete, because they'll do a lot of that, is really fundamental. So I'm probably one of those like I don't profess to be a master in any of these theories by any stretch, but I think I'm receptive enough and can recognize that's going to have an impact. That's going to positively impact. And if it doesn't, then we can perhaps move it to one side. But I suppose I recognize that the coaching process and then the performance process is littered with opportunities. And do we as coaches then go and I suppose identify, explore, go and practice in us with ourselves in terms of taking the time with athletes and our other coaches? How do we exploit that opportunity? So how do we prime our athletes? How do we introduce learning? How do we connect learning to previous learning? How do we go in there and interact with players? How do we consolidate and review? And we haven't even spoken much about practice. What the design of practice to allow that to happen? I mean, there's just half a dozen things. Like I think if coaching is a profession in that sense, how do we support coaches with all that? Because as I think you said, Martin, I'm not sure how much of that is on your coach education journey currently.
Well, the last 5 minute section, if anybody's listening that works in a coaching team and so the co-coach basically, you've just given the answer of how you plan and prepare and actually deliver co-coaching for me, like all these different things. So my observations of co-coaching, I'm the head coach. Will, you put the cone there, Sean, you do that and the other, and then at the end, oh, how did that go, fellas? Yeah, great. All right, see you next Wednesday. That isn't co-coaching. And look, I don't mean to, I appreciate some people working in a coaching team might be that's not their full-time job, so they're not afforded those opportunities to sit down and plan. But in environments where you are, for me, you've just provided not a blueprint, but a framework of how you can really create some meaningful intentions around what you're trying to do and how and why and how you're interacting. And I like your table in the excuse me in the chapter where you've got different questions framed around perception. These are for the athletes, understanding, interaction. I think that's a really nice way of doing that.
That was so obviously supported by Pete, but also another name not mentioned is head of coaching at Portsmouth at Pompey, James Barlow. So again, a futsal football connection, and that was all part of that co-coaching experience where there was one of those opportunities to interact. So I got quite frustrated was the word. I mean, it's part of the learning experience and journey for athletes, but I was like, we would create like, say, take a carousel practice. You might have two teams on court and one coach working with those two teams, driving some of the key messages and supporting the on-court actions. And then we might have another coach working with the team that was off the court. Initially, what we used to do was kind of just leave them to that. So remind them of the challenge or the problem they're trying to solve and kind of leave them to it. And what the book chapter spoke about is over a period of time, we felt that no, we need to facilitate that just a little bit. And then we, as a coaching staff and group, well, what are we facilitating here? How are we trying to support them for when they go back on court? And ultimately, it was around perception, understanding, and then collective decision making. And that was around this idea of, okay, what are you noticing and why is that important? how is that informing then as us as individuals and as groups of players, and that we're going to start to coordinate. And then the key bit, agreement, that of when they go back on court in terms of what they're going to do together to ultimately exploit the opponent. That was key. This is what we're going to try to explore and why. And if we see these situations, how are we going to adapt or look to I suppose win that advantage over our opponent. That's really key. That's really key for me in terms of the time with futsal. Like if you take a game, you might play for 3 or 4 minutes, then you're off for 3 or 4 minutes. So if we go into a match situation, what would I then hope to achieve? I would hope players are coming together in that 3 or 4 minutes. What have you noticed? Okay, I've spotted this with their press. So they're pressing us and showing us the middle of the court. Okay, our centre forward or pivot in futsal. What would your positioning be off that as a result? What space is opening up? Okay, I can probably get in the inside line there. What sort of, it's that kind of conversation that's ultimately driven and initiated through something that's happened maybe in training, but they're just in performance. They're in that zone. They're in that space. And then it might be a short check-in and challenge from the coach perspective before they go back on. Are you happy? What have you identified? It might be that the coach might say, look, I've spotted this. Have you spoken about that? Yes, we've got that under control. Brilliant. Crack on. That I think is a big part of the kind of the construct or ideas around how do we interact? What does that question look like? What does that discussion look like? And that was one example. And it doesn't happen religiously, but what it is about is making sure that players definitely feel a sense and there's some guidance supporting them to have those player-to-player conversations.
I really like that, mate. I really like that. It's some great insights there around coaching. Carl Woods talks about at the moment. He's talking a lot about correspondences, and I think there's something in there that your practice is giving players the ability to look at the shared affordances, to come together and see how training and match plays corresponding, and sort of take some of that ownership to solve problems. I think it's really cool ideas in there, mate. Very nice. Thank you.
Well,
I wonder.
well,
I was going to say, I don't know if we move on or we can. I think we could talk about this forever, but I just sort of wondered how some of this then is influencing your role now in futsal, where you've got a job not just as a coach and having been a player, but like sort of developing other coaches. How is this influencing your thinking in that space?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think there's something in this. I think there's one or two things in this. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, we have an opportunity through England Futsal to explore some of this further and what does this mean around, take that example, like okay, that again, I was referring to I suppose high performance and the international game, but there's principles there that I would absolutely use. And it wasn't that long ago I did an under 9s, under 10 sessions, and again my language will be different. The presentation of those questions will be different, but the process to support them to think for themselves, to start to find connections with their teammates. I remember doing just some basic sort of 2v2 exercises, practice, and again creating that space and opportunity for those players to explore that. It might be framed around how they like, find success because of the nature of the practice and where they can see rewards or how they can gain points or whatever. So yeah, it's really relevant, and I guess that's how do we take some of this and scale that, some of these big messages around what is the future of futsal coaching look like and coaching practice for futsal in England. That's probably where I'm exploring it. And there's we work in relation in partnership with the FA, around ensuring, go back to that initial conversation of futsal and football, to support football, but futsal in its own right. So we do need to have some coherent messaging there, which I think we're pretty good at. But absolutely, the experiences of coaching a futsal game and ultimately coaching or facilitating practice in training does afford some of this. And I think it's about how do we start to layer that up? How do we get coaches exploring some of this together? And the bit I'd always say is, a lot of people tell me we need more technical and tactical knowledge in this country. I don't disagree with that, but it's irrelevant if you can't create those connections, or if you can't introduce the learning, or if you can't then interact with your players around that learning and what you're supporting them. Because either you won't be able to facilitate that as a coach, and you won't necessarily have those tools to then engage, or at the other end, I always say it's not what you coach, it's what the athletes learn. They won't be able to interact back with you. They won't be able to provide you their sense of learning, their sense of understanding. This is how I'm seeing things. And of course, and people say, well, how does that happen with an 8-year-old? Time. It's like, well, it's not going to happen overnight, is it? It's like that's the whole point of play their way. We've just spoken about I don't want to say a generation, but in many parts of a young child's experience where they've never had or been given the time to answer a question, or to explore a conversation, or to choose what their practice looks like. And I think that's the important of the next generation of coaches. And hopefully with futsal, because we don't have some of that perhaps entrenched historical viewpoints or ways of doing things, it presents an opportunity. And I suppose, yeah, and then it's leaning on some very very clever and gifted people like yourselves to, well, can you come and help us do a bit of that in the future? Because yeah, it's taking some of these ideas, and then what does a learning journey look like? If we go down that kind of space, how do we support people? How do we engage them? How do we feel excited about this coaching? Because I think you said it earlier, Will, like it's yeah, it's not easy, is it? Like that. There's so much to it, and it's like, well, now we're going to support you with this. We're going to make sure you've got those right people around you, the right mechanisms to help you through that journey. But hopefully, it's an exciting one. So that's where I want to take it. I don't quite know what that looks like yet, but I've certainly got some really good people around this who have I don't want to say the same ideas, because we don't want to be locked in that one way of thinking, but ultimately some good people that want to get their teeth stuck into this. And yeah, let's try and scale some of this up.
Well, I think futsal in England's in a good place, sure, if you don't mind me saying. Yeah,
I hope so. Not yeah, we're getting there,
yeah, yeah.
slowly
Just
slowly.
yeah, yeah. Just back to the little ones, and you're saying it takes time. It's consistency as well, like the consistency of doing certain things. Because I totally get your idea about if it was questioning and they're not used to that. And I've worked with some adults that start asking them questions about some of the things we've been talking about, or just not even asking questions. You're in a discussion with them, and you can see they're so uncomfortable with it. It's like, look, I'm not trying to catch you out, or it's not. I'm not trying to assess where you're at. It's just I'm generally interested about engaging with you, and what do you see? Because I don't see what you see. It's just on a touchline, very different. And what I might see and the way I think about it is very different to what you see. Because when I played rugby, it was like 10, 15 years ago. It's a different game and there's been rule changes. So you'll see different things to me. Let's collaborate on that, and how can we then use that information to help you get better and help design practice and these sort of things. So yeah, it can be alien to some people, more of a collaborative approach, definitely.
I think, just going back to the book chapter and the physical space, and like how do we like encourage some of the relationships around practice, or the different actions of players. So one of the things we do is make sure that there's a tactics table. So like a tactics board, but tactics board is quite exclusive. Like the coach will get it, the coach will hold it, the coach will use it. It's like the table, all of a sudden everyone can come around the table. Everyone can start to put their hand onto the table and move the counters around. Same with young players. Now, you put there for 1 week and no one uses it because they don't quite know what that invitation is yet. But then weeks go by and it's that consistent use. And you start to see, we've done this a little bit with some adult sessions, more recreational sessions, where we start to bring some of these tools and resources, and all of a sudden they're picking them up, they're using them, they're having conversations. You walk by and they're talking about something we've actually been doing in training, and you're like, wow, that's amazing. So I think it's about like going back to the environment that you're creating. If you're never putting some of those things into thought and then into practice, then you're right, you're not going to achieve that consistency or subtle shifts in behavior that you can measure and go, yeah, a number of times coaches say to me, oh, I wish they would be more, immersed or engaged or have conversations around the game. Like no one watches football anymore. No one watches, no one watches the game. It's like, well, you've got to change that. You've got a role to play in which to shift some of that. And that's one small thing. The other would be like whiteboards and pens. With the Lionesses, we'd bring out a couple of whiteboards and pens, and we would say these boards, if you want to jot something down because you where your understanding is, or you want to ask a question, but it might not be the right time, and you just want to keep hold of it, use the boards. Of course, no one used it the first few sessions. Kind of knew that would happen, but over a period of time, kept putting it there. One or two started to go over and use it, and I think it's like, yeah, setting those foundations. What do you want this environment to look like, and how do we support that to happen?
Amazing, mate. There's going to be clubs up and down the country with Subbuteo tables next to the pitch.
Yeah, apologies if they have to go and spend. Oh, it's Black Friday anyway, isn't it, coming up? So there's something off there.
That's all I could think of. Amazing.
Yeah, really, really insightful conversation, Sean. Yeah, it's got me thinking about a few things, definitely. Yeah, really interesting. So, yeah, appreciate your time. And you're doing good things with futsal, so definitely keeping an eye on that. See how things evolve over the next few years. So yeah, good luck with everything.
No, thank you, appreciate it. And we've got the first men's home games for 5 years over the next few months, starting next month for their European qualifiers. So people not in futsal, as well as those in futsal, want to check it out. They're being played at Loughborough University. So yeah, just trying to hopefully share a little bit of what we do. But I really appreciate you guys asking me to come on and talk a little bit about what we've been up to, and probably caveat that a lot of us spoken about is groups of people supporting this. It's not just me, of course it's not. So just want to, yeah, thanks again, appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on,
Great.
mate.
Thanks, Sean.